You've made it to page 95. You're halfway through the book. We are starting chapter 9, Words Matter. It seems obvious and not worthy of mention, especially when discussing the pillar of language. But if you recall, the obvious is no longer obvious, just like common sense is no longer common. But words do matter to language in several distinct ways. And thus, the most effective attack on language is launched against the components of language itself, words being one of, but not the, most basic components of a language. Heading: Definitions matter. If we cannot get anyone to definitively agree on what a word means, this is another overt attack on the supporting pillar of shared language. The meanings of words matter. Definitions matter. If someone wishes to add cracks in the supporting pillar of language, there is nowhere better to start than with the words that make up the language. Each changed meaning is another hairline fracture in the base of the column. How can we share a language when it is constantly changing? And increasing divisions dictate that we will never and cannot agree on what the true definitions of words actually are. The first obvious use of this kind of attack for me was the redefinition of marriage. We will come to see that the two supporting pillars of the American civilization are inextricably linked to one another. Marriage was originally a faith-based covenant between a man, a woman, and God. The state recognized said unions. But if there was another union that was not a covenant union between a man, a woman, and God, but that the state did also recognize, then that union was called a civil union, which by definition is exactly what it is without the God component. Apparently, though, that term was never going to be good enough, as the anti-traditional values movement pushed and pushed and pushed to redefine the term marriage. I once thought that there were simply just some people who wanted to believe their sinful union, meaning their sexual deviance from biological and physical norms, referenced by Christians most typically or most famously from the Romans 1 passage where it says in verse 24, I think, that God gave them over, allowed them to indulge in their sinful desires of their hearts, including degrading themselves sexually, exchanging natural sexual relations for, quote, unnatural ones. So I once thought that there were simply just some people who wanted to believe God would embrace and celebrate the very relations Paul is saying God calls depravity. They wanted to believe their depravity was endorsed by God himself, so they could indulge in the desires of their flesh while still pursuing the other truths and promises found within Scripture. Anyway, that's why I once thought the term marriage was so important to the movement to co-op. And maybe that is still the case with the rank and file masses, but now I see this push at redefinition by the radicals as an early warning sign, setting the benchmark for what it takes to turn the obvious into the obscene. The term marriage evokes connotations that simply, obviously, cannot apply to a same-sex union. Yet those connotations are now considered obscene or bigoted. Once upon a time, ideas could marry each other because the pieces that are missing in one are found in the other to bring about a more complete whole. Actual physical items could marry each other, such as a screw and a washer. Plans could marry each other when they dovetail nicely into an unforeseen yet harmonious result because each plan filled in the gaps of the other. And this was based on the idea of female versus male, which were determined by the shape of the parts. In electrical and mechanical trades and manufacturing, each half of a pair of mating connectors or fasteners is conventionally assigned the designation of male or female. The female connector is generally a receptacle that receives and holds the male connector. Sometimes the terms plug and socket are used, or if the screw is the male part, the washer would be female. even the shapes of jigsaw puzzle pieces used this everyday terminology. Today, though, one won't find a definition based on that premise, nor will you find the covenant definition anywhere. Marriage today is a legal status, an association, a relationship between spouses, or the ceremony where two people enter into the legal relationship. In the redefinition of marriage, more than one concept had to be redefined because this concept was so universally understood that the building blocks used to define the concept also had to be replaced, redefined, or take on new meaning themselves. What was once obvious, common, and innate knowledge and understanding, natural law, has been rejected. Once, we all understood that the female part was what the male part fit inside, whether it was nuts and bolts, socket and plug, or jigsaw pieces. Gender and sex used to be interchangeable, not just in common language, but in textbooks and in the mouths of experts, doctors, and professors. What is a woman? This should not even be a question. Yet an entire film, actually a film I did not see, but it did make headlines, was not only centered on this question, but the title of the film was, What is a Woman? The answer should be obvious, but the obvious answer we all used to innately know and understand, the obvious answer, the one grounded in natural law, is now considered obscene. Side note, this is heading, side note, being you. Feeling like something does not mean you actually know what it feels like to be something you are not. One can only know what it feels like to be themselves. I don't have the hundreds of olfactory sensors of a dog, but I can guess what it might be like to be a dog, to imagine what a dog is thinking, but I can never actually be a dog, and there's no way to test the hypothesis that I feel like a dog because I can never become a dog to know what it is like to feel like one. Trying to align bodies to match what a completely unique individual believes they feel like is akin to saying that should I be able to exchange my vocal cords for a bird's larynx and my arms for wings and then miraculously fly because of technological advancement of drones, I will be closer to understanding what it feels like to be a bird. It is absurd. This is why gender dysphoria was, until relatively recently, a mental illness. Something is wrong. Someone does not feel right in their own body. But it is impossible to know what one should feel like. We can only know what it is like to be ourselves. I grew up calling myself the boy of the family. Where my sister's room was pink, mine was blue. I insisted on playing baseball instead of softball. I was more interested in the imaginings of war than I was in painting, needlepoint, macrame, or sculpture. I ran around all summer without shoes. I was what once was termed a tomboy. I was not a boy. I have no idea what it feels like to be a boy. I was simply Dorothy. This misaligning with gender stereotypes did not end when I became an adult either. Not even after I gave birth to my children. It was, and still is, difficult to live inside my head and to be me. But I am me. I never was, never will be, and never will be able to test the hypothesis that I think and behave more like a man. I can only imagine that being one's own self is difficult for loads of people. I'm just not sure why we are not trying to value each unique individual human being for who they are and how they were created, instead of telling them they need to change who they are to fit a mold that society expects them to fill. It took me decades and some therapy, but I love who I am. I wish others who don't feel quite right as themselves could learn to, instead of hating and rejecting who they are and were created to be, could learn to value themselves as unique individuals, just like I've learned to value who I am and the person I was created to be. But this is all part of the rejection of natural law. What was always natural has been exchanged for the unnatural. What was once obvious is now obscene. I don't even touch on the level of cognitive dissonance necessary to define truth the way it is done nowadays. I am not going to touch on biological males in girls' and women's sports or in women's prisons for sexual assault. I'm not going to touch on that. I'm not going to touch on the fact that this new movement has invalidated all the progress women have made while simultaneously emasculating men in an attempt to label all masculinity as toxic. I'm also not going to get into how this new movement should also throw into doubt the idea of homosexuality as an actual thing. The champions of women's rights and gay rights are now championing a movement that erases both. I don't talk about this in the book. There's so much more I could discuss on all of this, but I won't. I could also talk about polygamy, but I won't. Let's just go back. But this is all part of the rejection of natural law. What was always natural has been exchanged for the unnatural. What was once obvious is now obscene. Heading, end side note. We're back to definitions matter. If we decide there is no agreed upon definition, or that a woman is anyone who feels they are a woman and a man is anyone who feels they are a man, there's a slippery slope no one believes we will slide down because it seems so ridiculous. But the change in the meaning of these words once seemed ridiculous too. Does anyone who feels they are a bird have a right to try to fly, to launch from a tree or a high rise? Can someone who feels they are Filipino not identify as a Filipino? I am still waiting for the NAACP to apologize to Rachel Dolezal. Anyone who feels they are 10 years old, should they not be able to date a 10-year-old or enroll in 4th grade? If someone feels they are 65 years old, should they not be able to draw from Social Security? Or why shouldn't the 46-year-old man date a 12-year-old who identifies as 30? These are no longer rhetorical questions. They demand real, reasoned answers. Once again, we once thought normalizing the idea that abnormal and false beliefs can actually define truth, well, that's just ridiculous. Yet we already find ourselves in a ridiculous place, due in no small part to the rejection of natural law for our standard.